Yes, I'm Ian Robert Jones, and this is the Arts BC Facebook Live, sponsored by the 2018 Arts BC Conference. This year's conference is taking place at the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Centre in Burnaby, and it goes between May 10th and 12th. This year's theme is engagement in a new arts era. And with me to talk about engagement from a slightly different perspective is Lou-Ann Neel, and we are so thrilled to have you, Lou-Ann.
Thank you.
And of course, we haven't experienced any technical problems at all so far, have we?
I know more about the settings in my computer now than I ever did.
It's true. A little bit of Facebook Live is learning the settings, and I don't think you can see me, but I can see you, and everyone else can see us. So that's the main thing, Lou-Ann. So that's awesome. You're going to be taking part in the cultural appropriation panel that we're having on Saturday, May 12th, and we're going to talk a lot about appropriation in this conversation. But first of all, Lou-Ann, I want to talk about you, and we would like to know a little about you and yourself and your background. So tell us about Lou-Ann Neel.
Sure. Well, I'm from the Mama-Lilakla, Mumptigilog, and the Nakdalk on my mom's side of the family. And on my dad's side of the family, I'm from the Namgis, Kwekwasotinok, and Kwagil people. And these are all tribes of the Kwakwakiwak. Kwakwakiwak means Kwakwala-speaking people. And so I'm originally from Alert Bay. And I've been an artist for as long as I can remember, before I even knew what the word artist meant. And I come from a long line of artists on both sides of my family. And a lot of the work that I do now is very much along the same lines of what my grandmother, Ellen Neel, used to do back in the 40s and 50s here in Vancouver, BC. And so I kind of have, I like to blame this on my Gemini reality, that I have a left brain and right brain thing going on all the time. On one part, I'm an artist as many minutes of the day as I can get. But I also studied public admin early on in my career and have a gory fascination with policy. And so I do a lot of arts management and arts consulting work, and recently started to dabble a little bit in curatorial work as well.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I saw something in Victoria back in January. Is that you were curating something down there, weren't you?
Yes, that's right.
And of course, I really want to talk a little bit about your family, because you guys really do have deep roots in the province. You talked about Ethel Neel, but Charley James is your great-grandfather, and he's very famous in these parts, isn't he?
That's right. I love it when I come to Vancouver. I'm in Vancouver today. Every day I'm somewhere different. One of his totem poles that used to be at the Second Narrows Bridge, I think, or at Lumberman's Arch in North Van, is now in Stanley Park, and it's one of the most photographed and copied or appropriated totem poles out there in the world. I've traveled lots of different places in the role that I serve in. And inevitably, wherever I travel, whether it was Banff or Jasper or Japan, California, everywhere you could find these little plastic versions of my great-grandfather's totem pole. So it's a really iconic work, and you see it in a lot of images. I think actually the City of Vancouver's website probably has it as one of their images that they use on the front page of their website. And then, yeah, my grandmother, Ellen Neel, also did a lot of work here. She lived here in Vancouver for many years and did a lot of work here. And so her work is also replicated quite a bit.
And how do you feel about that? How do you feel about seeing your family's work replicated and out in the world? Because it must have sort of interesting connotations for you.
Yeah, it's a really it's a lot to process. I can appreciate that people love the work. There's something about it that obviously draws their attention and captures their interest. But at the same time, these works come from a really ancient tradition, artistic traditions that belong to our people. They're the intellectual property of our people. And A lot of that got eroded during the years that our traditional ceremonies and really all of our cultural practices and languages were made illegal in Canada under the Indian Act. People often refer to it as the potlatch ban era. And so a lot of the structures we had to protect our work and maintain the integrity of our artistic traditions, those systems fell apart. And we haven't really had a chance to rebuild them. That particular section of the Indian Act was dropped from the Indian Act in the 1951 revisions. And this was the post-war revisions that they made to the Act. So it actually wasn't formally rescinded. And if it had been, it would have been an admission on the part of the government that they should never have had that in the legislation in the first place. But it would have been an admission of wrongdoing. So it was simply omitted. They just didn't type it in when they retyped the new act. So we've only had, since the 50s, this period of time to rebuild some of those things about our artistic traditions that are important, but we haven't even really taken full stride on that yet. So it's hard to, I can appreciate that it's hard for the general public to understand what we mean when we say that it's not okay to copy or to do variations of our artwork, because it really does belong to us.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great place, though, to start a little bit, Lou-Ann. Not everybody might know exactly what you mean by cultural appropriation. So what is it? What does that mean for you and your community?
Well, all of the art form that comes from our community, whether it be carving or painting, weaving, cedar bark weaving, spruce root, and later on the different wool weaving that we traded with other nations. Those traditions are embedded in a much more complex system that every visual art basically has names or has some reference to or is involved in part of our ceremonies. They might be family crest symbols, which are a big part of our identity. And even the styles that are created by different artists belong to those particular families. So they're really, I guess, what Western culture would consider as real property. And you have to be taught the full discipline to do the work properly and to be able to innovate from it. So when I was learning, for instance, I had to sit there for days and days and days drawing these particular shapes until I got them, because you can't make anything until you learn those basic forms. So it belongs as part of our language, it's part of our dancing, it's part of our ceremony. All of this what seems like visual art to the rest of the world is fully connected to so many other parts of our culture. So you can't just take the surface image out of its context to place it somewhere else or to create a product out of it that you can sell on the market. What you're doing is stealing a portion of somebody's actual property.
And I think it would also tend to erode the indigenous culture as well because of that, because of the history and the ideas and the meanings of the particular types of styles and the traditions that are inside the artwork itself. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think the biggest problem I always have, and it's taken me years to get to the point where I can just look and smile a little bit, is well-meaning people try to copy this work, and they're not doing it correctly. So I can spot it a mile away when somebody's obviously done a copy. Formline, we call it formline art, and that's a term that came out of Bill Holmes' dissertation on West Coast art. Formline art and the kinds of style you see from this coast, it only comes from this coast. And it's much more complex than it looks. It takes many, many years to be able to use this tradition to create really those basic, simple motif kind of shapes that people are drawn to. It takes years of practice to do that, and just copying the surface of it and then trying to add your own flair to it doesn't work. You have to really know the tradition from the inside out, and it becomes very obvious when people are copying. So they mean well, but also what I've seen is people mash up different styles. Like they'll take a form that you might only see in a Nuchano from the west coast of the island, a Nuchano design, and mix it up with something that's perhaps Tsimshian or Haida, and then throw in another Kwagil shape. And they don't fit together. They're very unique styles, tribe to tribe, and they flow differently tribe to tribe. So it's a really, I think, amazing art form. And so I do get it why people are attracted to it. But I think that they're missing the point when they don't investigate further. And then we have to continue our work from our community side to be able to create places and spaces where these discussions can happen, where we can show people what we mean when we talk about the designs belonging to us or coming from our families, and why it's important to our communities.
I think that's really important to focus on. You're not saying that people can't use styles or imagine kinds of artifacts or artworks that are referencing the First Nations style. You're just simply saying they need to know how to go about it properly and with a kind of complexity that respects the community that these traditions emanate from. Is that correct?
Sort of. I guess what I'm really saying is when I see artists who have their own contemporary practice, say a painter, and I look at their particular style of work, I could see how our art form could influence their particular style, and but actually taking the shapes and inserting the shapes that come from our practice into their practice, that I think that's the outermost line that I draw, because I don't see that as proper either. When I was at Emily Carr, I finally got through my undergrad a couple of years ago. I had a really lot of great discussions with other students about this. It was a great place to have these discussions around this idea of being inspired. We don't need anybody to preserve our art form for us. We'll take care of that. So people don't need to worry about copying it so it can be preserved. If they want to be inspired by it, I think about something like, the Nike swoosh.
Yes, I know that Brian Youngen has done some stuff with that idea with Nike stuff, and I think it's fantastic.
I absolutely loved his exhibit and all the works he did, because it really pushed the envelope on some discussions that need to happen. But when you look at the shape of that swoosh, it's not unlike, as Brian showed us, some of the form line shapes that we use in our designs. Now, if I were a contemporary non-native artist, I could look at something like a thunderbird and see the shapes that are within a thunderbird's wings and the flow of how those we call them U shapes or split U shapes. I would want to, just as an exercise, do this air paintbrush thing and get the feeling for the shape, and then use that feeling to inspire your art. Don't just copy someone else's work, because from just from a pure Canadian artistic perspective, if you have to copy someone else's design and slap it onto your work, you're not making original work. You're just doing your rendition of somebody else's genius. So I think that, the integrity of all of us as contemporary artists has to be put out there, and we have to have those kinds of discussions. When I see ovoids and split U shapes that come from our culture and other people's work, I think, okay, so where's your original stuff? You know, it's about pride as an artist. You are trying to manifest and share a message and share beauty with the world. Share your beauty. Right? Share what comes from your.
What about somebody like Sue Coleman? I know that she's out there, and she's where. How does she fit in that spectrum? She does artworks that definitely reference the First Nations community. I think she says that she's just adapting styles and turning them into her own. I'm not sure what she says about whether or not they're inspired or she's inspired by those images. But how does, just as a reference for people to understand, maybe how does she fit?
Well, I think there's a huge difference between referencing and copying. And what Sue has done is, yes, she's learned how to make ovoids and U-shapes in various tribal styles, but she's not referencing and she's not being inspired, she's copying. And she hasn't been trained in our tradition. And in some of her pieces, I think she did a fair job of the shapes that she copied. But other ones, it's really obvious that she has no real understanding of how formline works. I think it's, you know, when I was in high school, I used to work at in the summertime at Arts of the Raven Gallery in Victoria for Tony Hunt and John Livingston. And, and I saw Sue Coleman's stuff back then. And I was really drawn to it because I liked the idea. It was something that I had thought about myself, but I was still very much in the early stages of learning. And but I didn't know that she wasn't Native. And I think that this is one of the things that, you know, we're encountering across many discussion circles everywhere. The failure to disclose. And the purposeful omission of the fact that you're not Native, that you just learned it on your own, that you're not trained. I think that people who do that are being dishonest. They're deliberately being deceptive, and maybe not maliciously, but they know that if they come out and say, I'm a non-Native who just likes, you know, this design so much, I just decided to do my version of it. But especially now with the use of social media, that's reaching a lot more of our communities and people are commenting on it. And so, yeah, just going back to Sue, I think that it would be nice if, I don't know, if she could be more forthcoming about what she's doing. She actually got into quite a long thread on Facebook with a bunch of us who were commenting on what she does, and still came across as though she was doing us a favor. And like I said, we don't need any help preserving our culture. We're doing a good job of it on our own.
Yeah. I want to talk to you a little bit about you coming to the conference, because I know that you're going to be talking about cultural appropriation on the panel. And this year's theme is engagement in a new arts era. And so we're going to be talking about engagement. And Kathy Ramsey, who's our Master-in-Chief, the chief at Arts BC, she had a couple of questions that she posted. And so I thought I'd ask you them because they're really great questions in light of what you've just said. I'm going to read what Kathy wrote. She says, Arts BC gets a lot of questions on cultural appropriation. How can community arts organizations develop guidelines and policies that protect the integrity of their mission by discouraging cultural appropriation? So how do arts orgs go about this? What do you think are some of the ideas that they could think about?
I think one of the, I actually spoke to this a little bit. I posted this on my Facebook earlier about, I believe it was 10 years ago that I actually presented at this conference when it was
that's right.
somewhere in the Fraser Valley. And back then we were talking about the fact that at the time there were 88, I believe, community arts councils throughout BC. And there were very few who could really list out how many Indigenous artists were members of their community arts councils, or had exhibited or had been engaged at all. And a lot of people were uncertain of how to approach local First Nations communities or friendship centers. So we had some really good discussions back then and some tips on how they could do that. I haven't run any numbers or checked any facts lately, but I would love to know how in the past 10 years community arts councils have engaged with local communities, and if they're still not getting that much engagement, how can we take this discussion to another level and really make some solid plans? Because what I'm seeing is that a lot of our artists, First Nations artists, Métis and Inuit, we're all still working in isolation of community arts councils, provincial bodies, even CARFAC. And we need to plug into that a lot more. But also these organizations, I think it's a matter of getting our relationships established and a comfort level with one another first before we start talking about writing guidelines. Because the reality is that we have over 66 language dialects in BC, 35 different language groups. Each one of those groups means it's a different cultural group, which means you're going to have different art forms. So it's pretty complex, and there isn't going to be a one-stop shop template that's going to work for everybody. But I think we can at least engage in discussions around the elements that each community needs to address, and how they can build awareness in the community. We're going to have to do this at a very local level. I've been advocating for at least the last 25 years to reestablish a provincial Aboriginal arts organization to support Aboriginal artists specifically. We haven't had an organization like that since 1986. So I think that's another reality is we don't have a resource organization that other arts councils can connect with and figure out how to get things started.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a really good point. Kathy's got a follow-up question. In fact, Kathy should be here today to do the interview because you don't need me when you've got Kathy. Kathy's follow-up question is, how do we encourage our member artists to take a critical look at their own practices? So on the one hand, Kathy's talking about arts organizations and what they can do, but what can artists them do? How do they need to start thinking about the way they work?
I think what happens is a lot of individual artists, like I was saying earlier, will see something, they'll be inspired, they'll want to incorporate something about coastal art into their work. A lot of our artists are online. I think seeking out the artist who's inspired you and making direct contact if you can through a message or email or whatever, or direct communication is really important, because I think what people are really looking for is to discuss things more. They could learn more directly from that artist about their particular cultural background. And if the artists are looking to collaborate or learn more, then they're going to have that connection. And to not be afraid about doing that. We really appreciate when people take the time. I know I really appreciate it when people just contact me directly. I've made my Facebook a public page so that when I post different work that I'm working on, I can get comments back and have discussions with people directly. So I've been, communicating with people around the world since I started using social media to share my artwork and to talk about it. So I think that the biggest advice would be, don't be afraid to just get in touch with us somehow.
Yeah, one thing I love about what you're saying, Lou-Ann, is that there's this kind of a common senseness to the whole thing. It's like, if you just think about what's kind of reasonable, you probably get to the solution here. This is a bit off topic, but I have to get it in because I want to hear you tell. Remember, you were telling me, I want to know the story about the UBC totem pole and the UBC Thunderbirds, because I think a lot of people don't probably know that story, and you told me a bit about it yesterday. Can you just fill that in? I mean, it's like, this is good cultural appropriation, if you want to call it that.
Well, back in 1948, my grandmother was commissioned to do a totem pole, so that she could, and wanted to do a totem pole to gift to UBC, because the UBC varsity teams at the time had already named themselves the Thunderbirds. And she really was a strong advocate for education, post-secondary education, and really wanted them to also have the name properly bestowed. And so she consulted with the chiefs from the Kwakwaka'wakw, and along with her uncle, Chief William Scow, Bill Scow, and alongside was Judge Alfred Scow when he was first arriving at UBC.
Right.
She presented this totem pole to the varsity teams, and officially, and with the backing of our people, named their teams the Thunderbirds. And it's probably, I think, from the research I've done, it's the only example and one of the earliest examples of a mascot or logo or team image that was done properly. Even though they had used the name Thunderbird for a little while before that, it still came back around, and the gifting of this totem pole was to always remind people at UBC of the story of perseverance and hard work and becoming victorious through integrity and honor, which is what the pole represents. So the pole was originally gifted at halftime of the varsity, or the homecoming game of the Thunderbirds in 1948. And the pole over the years deteriorated because it's been outdoors the whole time. So in 2003, 2004, our family got together along with the Musqueam people and UBC and talked about replicating the pole and then rededicating it. And so we did that. And this October 2018 will be the 70th anniversary of that totem pole having been gifted to UBC.
I love that story. See, to me, that's inspiring, Lou-Ann. I just think that's a fantastic story about how to do it right. But of course, I mean, that's what I say. You're all about the learning. You're asking people all the time. It's not to shut down the dialogue. You're asking constantly for people to learn, to understand, to educate themselves, to go forward in that regard. And so I think it's good that UBC, which is this, you know, this paragon of learning, this temple of learning, is learning, has learned.
Yeah, yes.
That's good. You know what, Lou-Ann, we're almost out of time, but one thing I like to do at the end of every one of these conversations is to give our audience a conversation starter, something that they can sit around with their friends and talk about, or at the water cooler, or maybe comment in the Facebook comments box below. Something that you would like to leave them with, a takeaway, if you like. Is there something you think that our audience should be talking about, or can you ask them a question to make them think?
Yes. One of the things I haven't talked about, and I hope I will talk about extensively at the conference, is where this all started. Where do people think this whole confusion around cultural appropriation and whether they are appropriating or not, where it all started? And the tidbit I want to leave in people's minds is it really wasn't until about the 1960s in Canada and probably across North America that our art was even considered art. It was always considered artifact because it was considered remnants of a dying race, a presumably dying race. And a lot of the activity that took place from contact up until the 60s around mass production by companies. There's companies in Seattle that still mass produce stuff that they just took back in those days. I think that one of the key pieces of information that people could learn more about and we could teach more about is the transition from artifact to art, and now coming into this modern time where we have to now have discussions since we're now recognizing our art form as a true iconic works. What can we do to make sure that all of us understand what our art form is, that it is a discipline, that's the same kind of training. That's why I went to Emily Carr to check it out, see what kind of training they offered. I received as rigorous a training in my art form as I did at Emily Carr. So yeah, just thinking about where that idea of appropriation probably started and how we can undo some of the damage of those earlier ways of thinking. We have to come up with new ways of thinking and to not be afraid to have the conversations.
Lou-Ann, this has been a total pleasure. You're awesome, and I can't wait to see you in May at the conference. Like I said, the 2018 Arts BC conference is being held between May 10th and 12th. Oh, and by the way, you've got until the 31st of March to get an early bird ticket. We should tell you that because, it's the 29th today? You've got 2 days. You can get a valuable discount if you go and do it now. And like I said, if you want to go and see Lou-Ann, she's speaking about cultural appropriation. That'll be on the Saturday. It's at 1:15 to 2:30, I believe, but check the schedule, artsbc.org for that. And Lou-Ann, you're awesome. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's just been a pleasure.
That went fast.
30 minutes with me, and you can't even see me. I can't believe it. It's too bad. That's our technical problem. We didn't tell you. Lou-Ann cannot see anything. She's blind, but she's not. She's not blind, but
I'm looking at this little camera on the top of my computer.
Well, you know what? You can look online. You'll be able to see yourself.
Out there. There we go.
Lou-Ann, thanks again. It's great talking to you. We'll see you in May.
You betcha.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.